Peppa Pig The Drawing. George had been sitting at the table longer than usual. His toys remained untouched. Even his favorite dinosaur stayed in the corner. He was drawing, focused, silent. Peppa noticed it in the afternoon. The pencil in his hoof moved carefully, as if he wasn't drawing from imagination, but copying something real. When she came closer, he gently covered the paper with his hoof, then slowly moved it aside. It was a house, unfamiliar, tall, with a jagged roof. The walls were gray, heavy, the windows narrow and dark, and in each one a shadow, a figure, no face, no detail, as if someone was standing inside looking out. Every figure was the same, as if it was one and the same silhouette, repeated in every window. George slowly added a door, large, slightly open. Peppa wanted to ask what it was, but he had already taken a new sheet of paper. The next morning, Mummy was making breakfast, Daddy was reading the newspaper, and Peppa looked out the window. She saw it, the house. It stood at the edge of the field where there used to be only grass, exactly like the drawing. Same roof, same narrow windows, and inside them, shadows, motionless. They didn't look like people or like animals, just silhouettes. Peppa wanted to tell her parents, but Daddy said the house had always been there. Mummy nodded. No one said anything else. After breakfast, the drawing was gone from the table. Peppa asked George, but he only shrugged. He was already drawing a new one. This time, the same house, but instead of grass around it, there was empty white space, as if the world around the house had been erased. The figures in the windows were closer, clearer. Now their heads touched the tops of the windows. One of the figures had a hoof drawn. It reached outward, toward the viewer. That evening, everything felt quieter than usual. When Peppa went to her window, she saw the house again. It was closer, no longer at the edge of the field, almost across from their own house, as if it had moved forward. The figures in the windows were nearer to the glass, and now it felt like they were looking directly at her, still unblinking. Peppa stepped away from the window. On the third day, George drew a staircase. It led from the house's front door, downward, somewhere inside. Too many steps, too steep. He blacked out everything around it, leaving only a dark pit. That night, Peppa woke up. George wasn't in his bed. She went downstairs. The kitchen door was ajar. On the table, a sheet of paper. It was their own house, but instead of windows, black squares. And in each square, the same figure, the one from the windows, repeated over and over. At the bottom of the page, in small letters, you. On the fourth day, she found another sheet. It was her room, the walls, the bed, the window, all exactly right. And at the window stood Peppa, drawn. But the eyes were different. Black, no pupils. The mouth, a thin flat line. The figure stood pressed against the glass, hooves on the windowsill. Outside, darkness. On the fifth night, Peppa woke to the sound of paper moving. Several new sheets lay scattered on the floor. One showed the front door of their house, wide open. Another, the staircase leading down. And beneath the last, largest drawing was a careful, almost printed signature. You're already inside.
Peppa Pig, the one who hides in the puddles. Peppa always loved jumping in muddy puddles. But one day, after a heavy storm, a strange puddle remained behind the house. It was darker than usual, deeper, and reflected a sky that wasn't there. Peppa jumped into it, and for a moment, she felt as if something grabbed her leg. "Mummy, there was someone in the puddle!" she shouted. "It was just your imagination," Mummy Pig smiled. But her eyes flickered, as if she already knew. The next day, George disappeared. His boots stood right by the puddle, and on the water, only a message written in mud. He jumped too. Peppa decided to jump in again to find him. But instead of water, a dark maw, covered in eyes and teeth, reached out to her. The last thing she heard was a voice from the depths. "You called me, Peppa." Now there are no more puddles near the house, but at night you can hear bubbling and a quiet voice. "Jump. Again." 3 days later, Daddy and Mummy Pig didn't mention George, as if they had forgotten he ever existed. Peppa tried to remind them, but each time her parents looked through her. "Who, dear?" "George, we only have you," said Mummy with a vacant smile. That night, the puddle appeared again, but this time it was right in her room, on the floor, gently rippling, as if breathing. Peppa got out of bed and approached. From the depths, a face appeared, her own, but with cloudy eyes and a crooked grin. "George is here, and now you must be too." A hand emerged from the puddle, made of water but cold as ice. It grabbed Peppa. Peppa awoke, in another house, similar to hers, but everything was grey and silent. In the windows, darkness. On the walls, photographs with crossed-out faces. And somewhere upstairs, rustling. She heard George's voice. "You came, now we can meet him." The door slowly opened on its own, and behind it, the one who hides in the puddles was waiting. Finale. Now I'm outside. Peppa ran down the dark corridor. Water splashed beneath her hooves. Behind, heavy breathing, the monster was following her. "Peppa, this way!" George shouted, peeking out from a mirror. She jumped. Suddenly, silence. Peppa awoke in her room. Everything was as before. George was playing, Mummy was making breakfast. But when Peppa approached the mirror, her reflection didn't mimic her movements. It smiled and whispered, "Now I'm outside."
Peppa Pig The Rain. The rain began on Monday. Fine, cold rain. It tapped against the windows, ran down the glass, and never stopped. At first, everything seemed normal. Daddy Pig joked that it was perfect tea weather. Mummy put their boots by the door. Peppa drew at the table, listening to the drops on the roof. But by Friday, the sky had turned completely black. Not grey, black, like spilled ink. And the rain grew heavier. The road outside disappeared underwater. Cars stood still. The neighbors' windows stayed dark. Curtains drawn. Parked cars fogged from the inside. "Why isn't anyone coming outside?" asked Peppa. "Everyone's home," said Mummy. "Everyone's waiting for the rain to stop." But her voice wasn't certain. No more post arrived. The lights in nearby houses stayed off. The TV only showed static, and in the flicker, a silhouette standing in the mist. Peppa first saw him on Saturday evening, outside, at the edge of their yard. He stood there, almost vanishing in the rain, tall, silent, a shape made of shadow and water. Peppa blinked, and he was gone. The next night, he returned, closer this time, by the tree near the house. His face was hidden, only a hood, only water. He didn't move, didn't wave, didn't speak, just stood there. "Mummy, someone's out there," said Peppa. Mummy glanced at the window and replied too quickly. "It's just the rain, Peppa." On the third day, Daddy stopped coming down. He sat in his chair upstairs, staring out the window. When Peppa approached, he didn't turn. His shoulders were damp. "Are you wet?" she asked. Daddy didn't reply. There was a puddle beneath his chair, even though the room was dry. On the fourth evening, the guest stepped closer, right under the window. He stood, arms at his sides. Water dripped from him in steady streams. He didn't knock, didn't call, just stood and looked inside. Peppa yanked the curtain shut, quick, tight, but she could still feel his eyes, through the fabric. On the fifth day, Mummy barely moved. She sat at the stove but didn't cook. Her clothes were damp, and water pooled under the sink, coming from somewhere inside the walls. That night, Peppa woke to the sound of dripping, but it wasn't rain outside. It was water in the house, drops falling from the ceiling onto the rug, drips leaking from the unplugged TV, doors swollen, soaked. On the sixth day, Daddy disappeared. Only his soggy newspaper remained in the chair, letters blurred like ink left in the rain. In the bathroom mirror there were prints, wet hoof prints, but not theirs. That night the figure tapped on the window, just once, softly. A palm-shaped stain remained on the glass, wet, the fingers too long. Peppa backed away. By the seventh night, Mummy was gone too. Only her teacup remained, filled with rainwater. Peppa sat on the floor with George. They held each other's hooves tightly. George stared at the ceiling. He didn't blink anymore. And outside, he stood, the guest, now closer, his face still hidden, but a smile appeared in the raindrops on the glass. Peppa closed her eyes. A whisper came, soft like rainfall, but inside her head. I'm already here. You let me in. By morning, the house was empty. Outside, no one walked the streets. The sky was still black, and in the window sat a small plush figure, pink, with button eyes. It stared out at the rainy, hollow world, and the rain never stopped. Peppa Pig, the other George. The morning started strangely. Peppa woke up in her bed. Sunlight slipped through the curtains. Everything seemed normal, but the house was filled with an unnatural silence, the kind you feel before you understand it's wrong. She looked at George's bed, empty. Peppa went downstairs. The kitchen was silent. Cups were on the table, but no steam rose from them. The ladle was resting by the stove. No footsteps, no voices. George? Mummy? Daddy? No one answered. She began climbing the stairs again, and then heard a creak from the bedroom. Her heart started beating faster. The door was slightly open. Peppa peeked in and froze. George was lying in bed, blanket neat. He was sleeping deeply, the dinosaur toy beside him. His chest rose and fell. His face looked peaceful, eyes shut. Peppa stepped closer. George, she whispered. He didn't respond. Peppa? A voice? She turned. George stood in the doorway. Also George, awake, real, staring at her with wide, frightened eyes. Who is that? She breathed. He didn't answer, just stared at himself, asleep in the bed. The one in bed began to move, sat up slowly, head tilted slightly to one side. A smile began to stretch across his face, too wide, too long, without blinking, eyes open, far too open. Who are you? Peppa shouted. That's George, but it's not him. The sitting George lifted his head. I woke up, he said. The voice was correct, but somehow misaligned, like a recording slightly out of pitch. The real George took a step back. He's smiling, he whispered. He isn't blinking. Peppa grabbed her brother's hoof. They ran. On the walls, photographs, Peppa and George. But now on every photo, two George, one familiar, one slightly taller, always smiling. Downstairs, the windows were dimmed. The house felt tighter. The hallway stretched unnaturally long. Crumbs on the floor Peppa didn't remember. Doors now led to strange rooms. A bathroom without mirrors. A living room with 3 sofas, when there had only ever been one. They locked themselves in the closet. Peppa was trembling. Say something, she whispered. I don't know who he is, George said. But I'm real. I remember when you taught me to draw the sun with little rays, and he just lies there and smiles. Peppa nodded. I know, she whispered. It's you, the other one. He wasn't breathing. Silence. Then footsteps, light, precise, even. He was behind the door. They could feel him. He didn't knock, didn't speak, he just waited. A shadow appeared under the door, small. Hooves. He crouched, peered through the gap. Too long. Then a voice, software flat, like it was being played back. Peppa, open the door. We're the same. They escaped through the back, but outside, the street was empty, all the houses shut, the windows fogged, and in every reflection, a shape that looked like George. That evening, Peppa lay in bed, George beside her. They held hooves. You're really you, right? She asked. George looked at her, smiled, silently, too long, without blinking. Since then, there are 2 George in the house. One plays with her, the other stands in the hallway, sometimes by the mirror, sometimes in the bed. Both of them smile. Peppa is afraid to fall asleep, afraid to wake up, afraid she won't notice when they switch places. Because one night, one of them leaned toward her ear and whispered, He's sleeping. You chose wrong. Peppa Pig, the extra rooms. One morning, Peppa woke up and went downstairs. Halfway to the kitchen, she stopped. There was a door in the hallway, where there had always been just a plain wall, where she had run past hundreds of times, now hung an old wooden door, cracked and peeling. The handle gleamed with dull metal, and there was a smell, dampness, and something else, something stale. Mummy, Daddy, Peppa asked at breakfast, where did that door come from? Mummy calmly poured tea and said, It's always been there, Peppa. Daddy didn't even lift his eyes from the newspaper. No one said anything more. After breakfast, Peppa and George carefully approached the door. Peppa placed her hoof on the cold handle and pushed. Behind the door was a room, empty, grey. The walls were cracked, the floor thick with dust. The air was heavy and damp, smelling like wet cloth. In the corner of the room lay an old battered ball. Peppa grabbed George's hoof and closed the door. The next day, another door appeared. On the landing, where a picture of flowers had always hung, the picture was gone. In its place stood a tall, narrow door covered in scratches. The room behind it was different again, a long corridor stretching into darkness. On the walls hung paintings, but the faces were blurred, as if they had melted in the rain. When Peppa called out, "Who's there?" only an echo answered, but it was not her voice. It was as if someone else had repeated her words, twisted and wrong. Every day new doors appeared, sometimes tiny ones, as if for very small creatures, sometimes huge, twice as tall as Daddy Pig. Once they even found a door right in the floor. When Peppa opened it, a wave of cold, damp basement air hit her face. Old rooms began to disappear. One day, Peppa went to find the bathroom, and behind the door was a dusty, windowless hall. Somewhere in the corner sat her old, forgotten potty. The house was changing. The walls seemed to breathe. The ceilings creaked. And in some of the new rooms, something moved in the shadows, very slowly, very quietly. But whenever Peppa looked closely, everything froze. When she asked Mummy, "Why is everything changing?" Mummy just smiled. "We're growing, Peppa." But her smile was too wide, and her eyes looked right through Peppa. Sometimes Peppa heard voices behind the new doors, thin, childlike. Peppa, George, but they weren't her friends. The way the name sounded was all wrong. On the 6th day, Peppa tried to open the front door, but outside there was no garden, no sunlight, only a dark, endless hallway, door after door after door, and in each room, behind the thin walls, something whispered. "We're alone here," George whispered. Peppa hugged him tighter. Suddenly, one of the doors creaked open just a crack. Something grey peeked out and quickly disappeared again. On the 7th day, their bedroom vanished. They woke up in a new room. The walls were unfamiliar, the ceiling too low. The windows showed not the street but thick, swirling grey fog. On the wall hung an old family photo, but instead of faces, only blank white patches. That evening they saw their parents. Mummy and Daddy stood in one of the new rooms, but their faces were different, as if someone had tried to recreate them from memory and got it wrong. Their voices sounded strange. "Welcome home." Since then, the Pig family's house disappeared from all maps. No one could find it anymore.